So I would like to introduce our first speaker. She's Maren Wehrheim. She's a master student at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, and she will talk about the prediction of human intelligence. So Maren, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just sharing my screen. Okay. So hi everyone, and thank you for tuning into my presentation. I'm Maren, and I'm really happy to present to you the work that I've been doing over the past year with all of these great collaborators. So we try to predict human intelligence from time-resolved brain connectivity. So broadly speaking, we analyze variations in the dynamic connection of different brain regions and how they relate to differences in human intelligence. And when using an average of the complete time series, we can predict intelligence with a correlation of 0.37 between the observed and predicted intelligence score. And now recent advances by the lab of Olaf Sporns have identified time points where the whole brain is highly connected. And these so-called event time points correspond to 5% of the complete time series and also capture the majority of the time average data and are also individually specific like a fingerprint. And therefore we hypothesized that these events might also carry the intelligence relevant information. However, as you can see, those events are rather achieve a mediocre result when predicting intelligence. And therefore we went one step further and asked, are there other 5% of time points in this connectivity strength data that are predictive for intelligence? And as you can see, the local extreme points in this connectivity strength are predictive for intelligence. And I'll go into detail about them a little bit later. So as a quick overview, intelligence is correlated with a lot of important life events, such as your socioeconomic status, health, or academic achievement. And in this study, we used the so-called Vasi Test, which is a measure for general intelligence and consists of 4 subtests, so a block design test, a similarity test, a vocabulary test, and a matrix reasoning test. And as neural data, we used functional MRI data. So people were scanned in an MRI scanner while at rest. So they were just looking at a fixation cross. And this data approximates the neural activity over time. And we can now parcellate the brain into 114 different brain regions, which correspond to 7 different functional brain networks. And here on the right, you can see the neural activity of 2 exemplary nodes. Whereas when we now calculate the correlation over all of the possible node combinations in the brain, we can calculate the static functional connectivity. So however, as the static connectivity is a time average, we hypothesized that calculating this might lose a lot of intelligent relevant information. And therefore, we use a new approach to calculate the dynamic functional connectivity. And to do so, we use an approach which was recently published by Esfalani et al. So it's also in the Olaf Sporns lab, which is quite simple but highly effective. So you can again think of 2 neural activity time series of 2 exemplary nodes, which are z-scored. And we can now calculate the frame-wise co-fluctuation by just simply multiplying the z-score time series frame-wise. And when we do this for all possible node combinations, we can calculate the dynamic functional connectivity. So from this dynamic connectivity matrix, we can then calculate the whole brain connectivity strength by calculating the root sum of squares over all of the possible node combinations. And as I mentioned before, we observe that there are time points where the whole brain is highly connected. And these event time points are defined as the highest 5% of this RSS time series. And then using either those 5% or the remaining 95%, we can reconstruct functional connectivity matrices from the selected time points. And then we can take these matrices to predict intelligence. And to do so, we use a new approach, which we term the Cmap approach, and I'll quickly walk you through it. So just think of the functional connectivity matrix, and we can now calculate the variance of this matrix into any direction using an arbitrary vector. And maybe think of this vector as, for example, the first principal component. And if we now keep this vector the same for all participants, we can calculate variance features for all of the participants. And maybe we find that, for example, for the first principal component, we do not observe a strong linear relationship to intelligence. However, if we now, for example, choose the second principal component, we might observe a strong linear relationship. But we don't want to just random guess which vectors might share a strong linear relationship, and therefore we optimize for this effect. So we generate features that share strong covariance between intelligence and those generated variance features, and then use these features to predict intelligence. And this is our Cmap approach. So the complete build-up is we use a leave-one-out cross-validation. So we have our training data and one left-out test sample. And we can now weight each participant's functional connectivity matrix with a mean adjusted intelligence score. And when summing over all of participants, we generate this matrix Q, which enhances differences in intelligence. And if we now calculate the eigen decomposition of this matrix, we generate vectors, which can then be used to calculate variance features, which share decreasing covariance to intelligence. So these have the highest covariance, whereas these ones have the lowest covariance. And as you can see, the vectors that generate the features with the highest covariance are also highly structured into the 7 brain networks, whereas the lower ones are rather random. Now, if we use those generated features, we can fit our prediction model, which is an ElasticNet. So it's basically a linear regression with L1 and L2 regularization. And now that we have our model, we can finally use our vectors to also calculate the variance features of the left-out test sample. And these features can then be inputted into our prediction model to predict the intelligence score of the left-out sample. So here, just quickly again, the 2 steps of our Cmap approach. So first, the feature generation, where we maximize the covariance, and then the ElasticNet prediction model to actually predict intelligence. And as already said, we only achieve mediocre results when predicting intelligence from the high amplitude time points. However, when predicting from the low amplitude time points, we can predict intelligence almost as good or as good as with the complete time series. And this is kind of like a sanity check. Then when removing those events, we do not remove the intelligent relevant information. However, we tested the events and their relation to intelligence a little bit further. So at first, we replicated the findings by Esfalani et al. That the high amplitude events reconstruct the static functional connectivity a lot better than the low amplitude time points. And also, and then we went further and showed that there's only a weak relationship between intelligence and the number of events necessary to reconstruct the static functional connectivity with a similarity of 0.8, so these points here. And then we showed also that if the events are not related to high in-scanner head motion, and that their temporal distribution is also unrelated to intelligence. So as an intermediate conclusion, we don't observe any predictive ability of the number of events, their temporal distribution, and when reconstructing functional connectivity from only these event time points. And this is surprising because the events capture the individual identifying information in the human functional connectivity. So as these 5% of events are not, seem not to be predictive for intelligence, we then ask the questions if we can identify other 5% of this time series which are predictive. And therefore, we looked at the extreme points in this connectivity strength time series. So on the left, you see the maxima in yellow and the minima in green. And everything above this red dotted line belongs to the event. So these would be event time points, but now we choose only those dots. And as the events correspond to 5%, we also want to select 5% of time points, which are predictive for intelligence. And therefore we choose the same number of maxima as minima. And we do not do this randomly, but we choose the lowest maxima and the same number of highest minima. And overall, this will give us 5% of time points that we will use to reconstruct functional connectivity and to predict intelligence. So here again, just several selected time points, and we use those time points in the neural activity time series to then correlate over these selected time points and to reconstruct functional connectivity. And as I said, we can predict intelligence with a correlation of 0.3 using those time points. So as a conclusion, the events are not predictive for intelligence. However, we find that the local extreme points of whole brain connectivity strength are predictive for intelligence. And thereby, we showed that actually in only 5% of the time series, there's enough information contained to predict intelligence. And all of our results also generalize to a new data set and also when controlling intelligence for age. So as our next steps we want to further analyze those time points and their neural mechanisms and how they relate to cognition and intelligence. And also if there's any effect of global signal regression on our results. So thank you for watching, and also to all of our great collaborators here.
Thank you very much, Maren, for your talk. Very interesting. And in the meantime, while we wait for possible question from the audience, I have one from my own. You are considering, let's say here, intelligence as just the IQ, right? So I think an easy critique could be that maybe intelligence cannot be measured by a single number.
Yes, so that's absolutely right. And in this case, we have an intelligence test that is often tested. So it's kind of a stable measure for this, but obviously it's a lot of noise contained in that one. However, we also use in this other data set, in the bigger one, we use different tests that are kind of combined to one measure in the end to predict them. So it also contains several different tests. But you might be right that it might be an additional approach to kind of maybe predict several measures, and some of them might be more predictive than just a single measure of intelligence. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we have one question from Bastian. Can you speculate on what is the meaning of these local extrema that are predictive for IQ?
Yeah, so this is the point that we're just analyzing. So we have different underlying effects in those local extreme points. So either the whole brain is a little bit active. So some of these time points that we observe, there's just a little, like a low connectivity between all of those, between the whole brain. Or we have the other effect where several brain networks are highly connected, whereas others are only weakly connected. And now the next step would be to analyze which of those processes are actually the ones that drive the prediction. So separate these events and maybe like find all these patterns happening in those local extreme points and separate those and their ability to predict intelligence. No.
Okay, thank you very much again for your talk and for answering our questions. So I will move to our second speaker.